Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to CSIS today. My name is Clayton Swope. I'm the Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. We're here today to talk about James Woolsey. Before coming to CSIS, at a prior part of my career, I spent 15 years at CIA, so I will probably refer to you, sir, as DCI Woolsey, if that's all right. That is near and dear to my heart and probably yours as well. Hopefully today we'll hear some great stories from friends and family. We'll also talk about a book, Guarding the Future, the life of R. James Woolsey. Just in brief, James Woolsey has spent most of his adult life seeking a more secure future for the United States and the world. As the nation's Director of Central Intelligence, Arms Control Negotiator, and Undersecretary of the Navy, he has advised 4 American presidents, 2 Republican and 2 Democrats. As a lawyer, he is one of the most influential voices in Washington on energy, intelligence, and security. Soon, I will sit down with Richard Haver to talk about his life. But before we get to that, we're going to hear from a few speakers about his achievements. And let me start off by introducing Lieutenant Colonel Josh Grindstaff.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to start with thanking the authors who unfortunately are not here this evening, but Bob Burke and Barry Epperson for telling Jim's story. I'd like to thank Mr. Swope and CSIS for hosting us all this evening. It's great to see so many friends here, especially Father James. So Jim and I first met about 15 years ago at a small cocktail party at a house just a few blocks from here, actually. And I remember sitting on one side of a friend's living room, and on the other side of the room was this very distinguished gentleman in a suit, and he was just doing this amazing impersonation of Kim Jong-il from in the scene from Team America World Police, where he's singing the I'm So Ronry song. Jim, by the way, is a great singer, and he's also a big fan of satire as a foreign policy tool. So from that evening, I think it was actually probably a couple weeks later that I actually found out who Jim was. And since then, Jim has really become more than a friend. He's really become like family to my wife and I and our 4 kids. Looking back over the past decade plus, I think for my wife and I and the Munchkins, as Jim calls them, some of our best memories are the times that we spent with Jim. From holidays, birthdays, graduations, weddings, going to the theater, camping trips, or just sitting around the house on Sunday afternoons reading stories to the kids. Speaking of kids, Jim, the Munchkins thought that I should pass on to the audience some important facts for those who may only know you as, former DCI, ambassador, undersecretary, author, or extremely dedicated public servant who spent a lifetime ensuring the safety and security of our nation. So for those of you here this evening who may not know Grandpa Jim so well, if you remember nothing else from this evening, you should know that Jim's favorite color is blue, and his favorite snack is blueberries, and also candy, and also ice cream. Grandpa Jim is a great singer and storyteller, and he knows a lot about history. Jim, we love you. We're so thankful for your friendship and your service in defense of our nation. And of course, we're really excited to read your new biography. With that, I would like to welcome Miss Linda Webster to say a few words.
Okay, with a name like Webster, you're probably wondering, why isn't William Webster standing here? My household, husband, household director FBI, director CIA, but I said I wanted to speak, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm in love with Jim Woolsey. Also. And while he would tell you a lot of business-related things, I'm sure you're going to hear this with other speakers and with the interview, but I want to tell you why I love Jim Woolsey, and probably why Conchita loves him to some extent. She'll have her own stories, but I'll try to put a few of Bill's words in a few remarks as well. Bill and Jim are a lot alike, and that's probably why I love Jim Woolsey. Because there are several really important similarities. Both are great public servants. They're also private men in public service, which was very important to my husband, and I know was very important to Jim. Because as many of you know in the room, it's very important to have private thoughts in government and vice versa. So like my husband, Jim went in and out of government, and I think we're better off for it. They have several similarities in terms of their careers. They both served Republicans and Democrats, as pointed out earlier, and they did so not as Republicans or Democrats, they did so as Americans. Wouldn't we all wish we could do that more? In fact, I remember when I was dating my husband, I invited him to a very partisan event, and he said, I am so sorry, I don't do those things, because in this job, I'm an American, I'm not a Republican. And that always set really well with me, especially when you're dating somebody, you start checking things off about things you like. That was one of the things I most admired, and I'm guessing Jim Woolsey said similar things as well. Bill and Jim also have Navy ties. Bill went into World War II, and he did such a good job in World War II that they invited him back during Korea. Jim, being younger, he went in during the Carter administration, if I recall, as undersecretary, so he too had a Navy stint. He was going into government just about the time Bill was called by President Carter to go to the FBI. So again, a tie there, both in Washington at the same time. They both served presidents, many presidents, as pointed out earlier, but they both served Carter, Reagan, Bush 41. And the difference is with Bush, I'll segue here. Jim and Bill had a slightly different chance to work with presidents when they were CI directors. I famously love Jim saying he had a tough time sometimes getting the attention of his president. And I love the quip he made years ago. I remember when a plane crashed in the White House. Jim, I remember, was quoted in the newspaper saying, that was me trying to get a meeting with President Clinton. That speaks to his humor, and I just love that about him. He's got, I think, one of the greatest sense of humor in Washington. My husband was luckier. He was a CI director under Reagan, but longer even with President George H.W. Bush. And as you know in this room, he was a director of Central Intelligence, so that helped. So there are a couple other things I'd like to point out. Both husbands married well. Conchita. I'm very modest, as you can tell. And then finally, there are a couple personal notes that my husband would not notice, probably, if he were speaking. Jim does sing beautifully, as pointed out earlier, but my husband would never have known what a great dancer Jim Woolsey is. He is my favorite dancer in Washington, D.C. So anyway, there are just so many reasons that I love Jim Woolsey, and we love Jim Woolsey as Websters, but there are very few people these days that are true Americans in terms of serving many, many governments. And I just hope I can tell by the support in the room that we're all hoping we can get back to having more Jim Woolseys and Bill Websters in government.
Good evening. I am Jenny Campbell, and I have the pleasure of serving as Vice President and Publisher for the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. Founded in 1927, our organization was created to honor our state's best and brightest with induction to the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. And that is where I met the ambassador for the first time. In 2004, when he was selected for induction as the scriptwriter, I found myself I was knee-deep in a wide range of accomplishments, interests, and ideas. The challenge was to put all that into a 4-minute video for television. It was quite the challenge. But it was not my writing that stole the show that night and got a standing ovation. It was the ambassador's acceptance remarks. Of course, he used his time to thank his colleagues, his family, and his friends for attending. But he used the majority of his remarks to recognize a 19-year-old Navy corpsman he had met only a few nights before. The young man was receiving the Navy Cross for his heroics during an assault on the Saddam Canal Bridge. With no regard for himself, this young man braved fire and evacuated and treated multiple wounded. The ambassador chose his time that night to remind all of us and the other honorees we were able to celebrate their accomplishments that night during peacetime because of that young Navy corpsman and the many, many, many more just like him. You may also not know that the ambassador originally was going to teach history, but an event in his young life changed the trajectory. While at Stanford, he and his fraternity brothers offered a room to a Nigerian graduate student. But the alumni fought the decision, stating that the charter did not allow for the sons of freemen to associate with the descendants of slaves. Woolsey led the fight to have the discrimination clause removed, to secede from the national fraternity, and to buy the fraternity house, for no greater reason than it was the right thing to do. These are but two instances that show the soul of the man that we are honoring this evening. The legacy of Ambassador Woolsey lies in his incredible ability to get to the heart of the issue, to see deeper than the rest of us can see. He has dedicated his life in a myriad of arenas to writing our past and guarding our future. Thank you. And now, please welcome Father McMurray.
Well, when Jim Woolsey was a boy growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he loved to call himself an Okie. Much to the chagrin of his mother, she considered the term demeaning. To his mother, the precocious 13-year-old Jim retorted, "If Okie was good enough for John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, it's good enough for me." Anyway, that precocious Okie lad was destined to become a Rhodes Scholar and ever the Renaissance man with an electromagnetic personality. He has the highest IQ of any person I have ever known. And his range of wisdom includes quoting the German poet Goethe, the humor of Oscar Wilde, significant data from US history, scientific technicalities, and insightful political analysis. Though Jim is as bald as a coot, he verifies and gives living testimony to the adage that God only made a few perfect heads, the rest he covered with hair. I suppose you can take the man out of Oklahoma, but you cannot take the Okie out of the man. Jim has ever remained the quintessential Southern gentleman with a folksy touch. One day, while he was the CIA director, he flew to California for his Stanford University reunion. He paid from his personal funds for his own economy ticket and for the tickets of his bodyguards, whom the agency required accompany him. Now, they sat in the rear of the plane with diminutive Jim sandwiched between the two hulking bodyguards. And though Jim, at the end of the flight, the hostess, who had served them coffee, remarked about Jim to the bodyguards, "This man is the most polite prisoner I've ever met." Anyway, I've had the humble privilege of accompanying Jim on his unique spiritual journey over the last decade, punctuated by key moments which led him to convert to Roman Catholicism as I received him into the Catholic Church on Christmas Eve 2017. Over a decade ago, Jim and I prayed together in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, before the fire, of course. Jim later made 2 Catholic retreats with over 300 professional men at Malvern near Philadelphia. He went on pilgrimage with me to religious sites in Rome and Poland. My memory of Jim in Wadowice, Poland is indelible. There he prayed at the birthplace of his hero, Pope St. John Paul II, to whom Jim gives great credit for the collapse of the Iron Curtain, which Jim himself had witnessed with his own eyes as the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. Now, a few years ago, Jim and Conchita visited me in Ireland while I was stopping at my family's ancestral homestead in County Galway. Jim regaled my relations with a repertoire of Irish rebel songs. So, although Jim Woolsey is an Okie with some Scottish heritage, I am convinced that deep inside him there exists an inner Irishman, or better, an inner Irish rebel. Do not be surprised if before the night is over, you hear Jim's inner Irishman crooning the old Celtic rebel song, The Rising of the Moon. Not now, though, Jim. Yeah. We dare not say that Jim Woolsey croons like a banshee between those leprechaun ears of his, nor does he carry an Irish pike staff, though his brilliant mind was ever as sharp as a pike. Yet we can surely affirm that Jim Woolsey, in all of his years of public service, has been as passionate and committed to guarding the future as were those Irish rebels of old when they chanted, "Death to every foe and traitor, whilst out the marching tune, and hurrah, me boys, for freedom, 'tis the rising of the moon." Don't start singing yet. For all I can guess, Ambassador Woolsey may even have had that song in mind when, as the hard-nosed chief negotiator in disarmament talks, he gave the Soviets their comeuppance. Ever guarding the future, this indomitable icon of freedom and faith has shown the world, by sunlight and by moonlight, the integrity of America the Beautiful. Now, don't start singing that song yet either, Jim. And finally, in these latest years, Jim's beloved wife, Conchita, has devoted herself to himself 24/7. And while she remains besotted by Jim's blue eyes, the fact is that Jim Woolsey simply cannot take his eyes off her. His beautiful, caring, intelligent, vivacious wife. May God bless you both in the years ahead. And now I'm very happy to present our next speaker, Ben Woolsey, the youngest of Jim's 3 sons.
So first I wanted to start by saying, I love the fact that you love my dad and that he's a great dancer. There was actually a reporter in, I believe it was the late 90s, coined a phrase to Woolsey the dance floor, which meant to spin around and dance with every single person you could possibly find and leave the entire room enchanted. And that's what my dad has done both professionally and socially for his entire life. So I wanted to start by saying that I did meet my dad at an early age. But in all honesty, it's actually really great to see that there's a lot of people here that have known my dad even longer than I have. And that's amazing to me. That really speaks to my dad's friendship and soul for how he has been able to keep so many good friends in such a crazy, crazy town as this. You've heard a lot of people talk about my dad's ability to, talk and think and, be able to express himself well. But I wanted to get into one thing, which is my dad, the consensus builder. And what I mean by that is my dad, well, let me start by saying this. My dad has never actually been one to be mistaken for someone who doesn't express his thoughts, right? So has a tendency to be able to state what he believes, and no matter who he's talking to. And it makes me remember a quote that he always used to give to my brothers and I, which is this. It's Roy Rogers. So it's always misquoted as Roy Rogers saying, I never met a man I didn't like, which is frankly a bad quote. It's also wrong. It's, I never kidded a man I didn't like. And what that means is stand by your ground, stick to your guns, be proud of who you are, and find the strength to be there for you and for those you love. Now, on top of that, and besides that, my dad has been able to work through so much discord, work through so much confusion with so many different people and find little strings of commonality and little strings of understanding that he can build coalitions with so many different people that you couldn't even imagine. For example, you're able to bring energy independence conservative hawks together to the table with evangelical Christians, with climate activists, all for the importance of ending oil dependence. Now, I think that coalition building is partly my dad's just innate soul, but I also like to think that trying to raise 3 sons might have had something to do with that too. I would just say this, kind of to finish. To me, the ability to see the good in people that may look different to you has been the greatest gift that you've given me. I appreciate that. It's also one of the best lessons you ever taught me. That and don't leave mayonnaise out in the sun. That was a good one too. Now, anyway, so thank you very much, Dad. And with that, I am going to hand it off to his lovely wife, Conchita.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, directors. My name is Conchita Woolsey. Before I give my little talk, yes, I'm sorry. Is this better? Before I give my chat, I would like to read a tribute for Jim from his former deputy director and very close friend who could not be here with us today, William Studeman. So it goes like this. My name is Bill Studeman, Admiral U.S. Navy, retired. I was the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence and CIA for 15 months of Bob Gates, 2 years of Jim Woolsey, and 7 months of John Deutsch. and acting director for periods in between. I served under 2 administrations. Jim and I served together in the post-Cold War and also post-Desert Shield, Desert Storm eras. The world was somewhat quieter under our leadership, which gave us some time to consider the future world of international and national security. Our time was spent working both intelligence community management, staff issues, and the missions of today's Director of National Intelligence, and the issues and activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. Our job was to be farsighted and to work with the White House, whose interests in the intelligence businesses of our nation, speaking candidly, ebbed and flowed, but whose departmental interests remained strong. The Middle East threats were on the horizon after the defeat of Iraq and Kuwait, and the need for improved long-range intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, was palpable. Perhaps Director Woolsey's greatest legacy would be in the areas of promoting and leading developments and relationships in the multifaceted areas of global unmanned aerial and also space reconnaissance, especially the platforms and technologies of UAVs. Jim's leadership and dogged pursuit in the UAV domain of reconnaissance set the stage for what was to follow, and what today has evolved into a part of yet another ongoing revolution in military intelligence and intelligence affairs involving the double-edged swords of now weaponized drones, robots, automation, and the early days of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Jim and I were not only intelligence colleagues, but we sailed together, along with others in the room, rafting up around the Chesapeake. Who can but forget Jim carrying a tune on countless ditties late into the evening. The 2 years passed quickly, as they should, when you are doing the business of our great nation. Jim and I have remained friends ever since, and I thank him for our past relationship and wish him and his family great grace for the future as I fondly reflect on our past association. With great respect, Bill and Diane Studeman. Okay. Well, as for me, you know who I am now. It is an honor and immense pleasure to stand here with you sharing the reasons why I believe my husband is an extraordinary man in every way. As his wife, number 3, I can clearly remember what spellbound me to Jim at the autumn of our lives. It wasn't just his crystal blue eyes, which are beautiful, his extraordinary wit, uncanny intuition, sophisticated intelligence, a very naughty smile sometimes, or even his baritone voice, which he, of course, exploited to seduce me during our early years. In addition to those many attributes, what fascinated me first about Jim was his response when I asked what he did as Director of Central Intelligence. With a perfectly straight face, he said, "I lied, cheated, and robbed." Pause as my eyes widened. He then clarified and said, "For my country." I almost fell over. I can remember that with mouth agape, I was in love. Jim was it. The man I had always dreamed of, the man I always envisioned at my side, even if it was later in my life. The rest, of course, is history in the making. Although my life with Jim is one of God's many blessings, the road has not always been paved with roses. In April of 2021, Jim was sanctioned by the Russian government only 2 months after Operation Dragon was published. The book tells the history of the KGB. 1 week prior to publication of the book, in February 2021, Jim suffered the loss of his close friend and co-author, General Ion Mikhail Pacepa, the former director of the Romanian secret police under President Nicolae Ceausescu. General Pacepa was the highest-ranking defector from the East. He collaborated with the CIA after, when he defected, and became a government target of the infamous Carlos the Jackal, of whom countless books and films have been written highlighting the attempted assassination. As if that sad fatality was not enough, in August of 2022, Jim suffered the loss of yet another very close friend and esteemed colleague, the tireless advocate for national security, Dr. Peter Vincent Price. Today, at the tender age of 83, Jim stands strong, a testimony to courage under fire. Devoted to national security of our nation, his family and friends, and in spite of the long shadows that currently envelop that beautiful mind, he is a noble man, the most noble man I have ever met. Forward-looking, humble, filled with love for his country and fellow Americans, and one of the fiercest patriots this country has spawned. Countless awards, accolades, and appointments by 4 United States presidents, as you heard earlier, corroborate his courage and devoted service to America. But for me, Jim is a man who has no equal, the only man who has pierced my soul. Thank you, Jeannie, Bob, and Barry, for making Guarding the Future a reality. The biography encapsulates Jim's countless achievements. Jim, you deserve this long-awaited acknowledgement. Thank you, darling, for your patriotism, your service, and choosing me to ride the Maverick. Thank you. I forgot to introduce the most important 2 people, Clayton Swope and Jim's close friend and former colleague, Richard Haver. Please welcome.
I figured I'd face the boss and he could give me the, whenever I stepped out of line here.
Richard, nice to have you.
Great to be here. Wonderful. A wonderful occasion for a fabulous guy.
Yeah, as we all know, we're here to talk about this book, Guarding the Future, and about DCI Woolsey. I thought maybe we could just start off, tell me how you know him. What's your story?
Well, I first met him when he was appointed as the Undersecretary of the Navy. And I was in Naval Intelligence. And remarkably, the new Undersecretary of the Navy had a huge interest in intelligence. It wasn't as though other undersecretaries hadn't been interested, but Jim's interest was unique. He dove into it and in every aspect, and it was wonderful to have, if you will, a customer who was so engaged with what you were doing. And he encouraged us to really get after it. It was an interesting time. I know Judge Webster will remember we were beneficiaries of extraordinary things begun in the 1950s, and then in the 60s and early 70s. We were standing on the shoulders of the giants of the intelligence world who created systems that pierced, if you will, the veil of secrecy around the Soviet Union, in particular, the Warsaw Pact, everything from recruitment of terribly effective and useful assets inside the Soviet Union to remote sensing of almost every description. And it, for one reason or another, the grace of God, it came together in the middle of the 1970s in extraordinary ways. And all of a sudden we had this, if you will, second level manager, the Undersecretary of the Navy, who wanted to be briefed and wanted to have a conversation basically every week. It was a unique experience, and it was very fulfilling. And he pushed hard that this needed to get all the way to the top. It needed to get to President Carter. It needed to get to the Secretary of Defense. People needed to pay attention to this. And he was tireless in pushing for it. It eventually happened. I'm sure there were other people pushing it too, but Jim was one that certainly got my notice. And then he went off to the private sector again, although his time in the private sector never really left government. In many respects, the law firm he worked for is an offshoot of the U.S. government in one form or another. So he was around, and then he becomes the new director of Central Intelligence. Bill Studeman and I had moved from being if you will, the seniors in naval intelligence to being seniors in national intelligence for Bob Gates. And of course, we were used to the possibility that a new person comes into the DCI's office, you're no longer needed. That you were eased out and back to the private sector someplace. So, but with Woolsey's coming, well, we know him. So he shows up and he says, "You two aren't going anywhere." I know you. The thing that I always liked the best, Jim hated yes men. I wouldn't say hate in the way of saying he disliked them. He didn't trust them. He knew that the bureaucracy was full of people that try to play to the needs and the likes of the seniors. And Jim wanted people who would argue with him. He wanted people who would tell him something that wasn't quite right in his head, make him think about it. And he kept pushing us to do that. And it was refreshing to have a senior that did that and prepared me to work for people like Caspar Weinberger and others later on who, if anything, eclipsed Jim in pushing for it. Rumsfeld and Cheney, that was uncontrollable. But it began with Jim.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I call it speaking truth to power about people who speak what's on their mind.
Whenever you hear somebody say they do that, it means they don't. If they have to say it, it means they probably don't do it. That's been my experience. Everybody I've talked to says, "Oh, I speak truth to power." Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, and I think there's a good vignette in the book that involves Deputy Secretary of Defense Nitze at a dinner party. I think the argument was about the Vietnam War with DCI Woolsey, and I think the story was that it was a heated argument. There was a disagreement, but at the end of that, Nitze said, I want that man on my negotiating team. And I think that was because he's not a yes person. It sounds like that was something that featured throughout your time knowing him as well.
Yeah, and Jim was always suspicious when it was too good a story. I can remember briefers coming in and telling Jim something about a world leader, and it was very rosy, very positive. And Jim would listen to it very politely, and then he'd say, the last perfect person passed away 2,000 years ago. The rest of us are all sinners. The only question is, how big a sin and how often? So then he would press the briefer for what's wrong with this person. What's this person's weakness? Is this person a gambler? Is this person a drinker? Is this person, playing? What's the whole story? As an historian, he said he always found the most interesting parts about studying a major historical figure to look at what the weaknesses were. What were the problems that pushed him? And I would say that a lot of the things we did with this intelligence in that 70s and early 80s period was understanding what the other side was afraid of. And we found, to our surprise, to some extent, they were afraid of a lot. There was a lot they were afraid of, and that became something that could be exploited in a strategic way. It also bothered him, back in the late 70s, that we were as vulnerable to some of these problems. A lot of the things I read and watched Jim preach about later on, whether it was dependency on oil or the problems with our infrastructure, it stemmed from that period. As we examined the weaknesses of others, we had to examine the fact that we had the same weaknesses. And as I watched him, he moved on through the next coming decades, trying to make people aware of that and wake them up out of their, we're the sole superpower sort of thinking.
And do you think the appreciation, the understanding of history, I know we've talked about that a few times, is something that DCI Woolsey is very interested in. Do you think that helps too with that perspective?
I think it's been said here, it's said very well in the book. He's a walking, talking historian, even if he never got to be the history professor. I once remember somebody introduced him as Dr. Woolsey. And he got up and commented that he really wasn't a doctor. He dreamed of being a doctor of history, but he never quite got there. So you can just call me Mr. Woolsey. Typical of him. But I can remember briefers coming in to talk to him about a subject, and before they left, they got a history lesson about all of the things they hadn't considered. I remember briefings being given to him about the Middle East, and he's describing battles between Muhammad and various tribes in 1,000 years ago, and where they took place and why they're important in understanding the Middle East. And I'm sitting there as a history major from Johns Hopkins, but I never heard any of this. And I went back and checked him, I have to admit, because he would insist on me doing this. And sure enough, every word he said was absolutely true. So, I once again kneeled to the mind of Jim Woolsey.
Yeah, and Richard, I think, looking at the past maybe for lessons that we can use today and understanding our adversaries. I think one thing that I also noted, in particular reading the book, was that DCI Woolsey had a very good knack for looking to the future, what we'd be talking about, the threat environment down the road. Things that I noticed was a focus on technology, using that to stay ahead of adversaries. I think that's represented in how he looked at UAVs and space-based systems. Also, just concerns about, at the time, the Soviet Union's ability to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum. And those are things that we see today with Russia in Ukraine. So just very much having a prescience for the future, to have a crystal ball to see what's going on. So I just kind of wonder if you could talk a bit about that, if that's something that you've observed over time, just looking back on the threats decades ago that you focused on, and kind of how those have played out today.
Well, as I said, a lot of this came together in that late 70s time frame. And he was definitely looking ahead. I mean, it wasn't that we were vulnerable in 1978 because the adversaries hadn't developed that capability. But he had seen the capabilities we were developing, and he knew they would come along. Electromagnetic event, we were way out ahead of them, okay? And Jim knew it, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. And it wouldn't necessarily be the Soviet Union. It could be any one of the enemies. And also it would empower not necessarily states with vast resources to pick on a particular problem and put us at a disadvantaged position in terms of trying to get the right solution to a problem. Again, this motivated him almost 50 years ago. And it continues too. I mean, you read his recent writings, they are reflective of the same thinking.
Yeah, and I can just think of, it's an article in the Washington Post in April 1981 that's cited in the book that, and again, not to hammer on EW warfare, but just that we just can't shrug off our own vulnerabilities in command and control communications. And I feel like it's something that could be written today from lessons with Russia and China looking to the future.
He sanitized that in 1981 because he knew exactly what was going on.
I think the emphasis on allies and partners, I think all the experience with NATO rings just as true today as it did then. Just kind of curious your thoughts, if you could get in DCI Woolsey's shoes, looking ahead. I think the book, it ends, looking at threats that lay beyond the horizon. What are those? If you're kind of looking through the optics of the past and then kind of trying to project, which he did so well, into the future, what should we be thinking about?
Well, I would say that, again, he was fascinated in the technology. He might have been a history major, but the technology side of it pushed him very hard, and he pushed us very hard. Jeff Harris is in the room, and when Jim was a private citizen, he kept getting involved in the government. He was on the Rumsfeld Commission on the ballistic missile threat to the U.S., in which he saw that the intelligence basically had been tilted to tell the Clinton administration what it wanted to hear, and he saw that the real information was something else. And they wrote that report, and it was not warmly received, either in the Clinton administration or inside the intelligence community. Bob Gates, at a later time, Bob Gates went to reform the intelligence community in the latter part of the Bush administration. And he brought Jim in to look at this. One of the things he was looking ahead, this was Gates, who has a lot of similarities to Bob. Gates realized there was going to be a budget crunch, that there was going to be a peace dividend, there were going to be cuts done, and he wanted them to be done right. So he asked Jim to come in and study the entire constellation of intelligence resources in space and to prioritize them and give him an idea about how to intelligently rebalance this system. And we gave him Jeff Harris to be his sidekick. They came in with a brilliant piece of work, which Bob Gates completely embraced and put into place. Of course, Woolsey reminded me 8 years later that the forces of evil had taken this guideline and simply decided, well, let's just make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And so they did great damage to the system, which we then had to repair later on. Jim has a long memory. Do not do something for him and then it turns out to go sour. He will remind you that it went sour. He'll do it with humor and friendship, and he'll make you feel good about it to the point when you go home and say, no, I shouldn't feel so good about this. But he knows how to make a guilt trip acceptable, if you know what I mean. Well, right, Harris? You should really have Harris up here. We could both tell stories. We should have Joyce Pratt, his lady friend, up here, and we could really tell you the Woolsey stories.
Well, so far, pretty good stories from you, Richard, so I think you're doing a great job yourself. Happy to be up here with you talking about DCI Woolsey. The last thing I just really wanted to hear your thoughts on and talk more about, I think we've talked about character, and we heard a lot about DCI Woolsey's character from some of the speakers earlier today. We talked about his, I know you don't like it, speaking truth to power, but not being a yes person. One of the things that I just thought really stood out in the book and has stood out through the speakers today, I guess I'd call it Focus on respect, mutual respect, civility, the ability to have different ideas, have arguments, not focus on the person, but focus on the issues. There's a story in the book. It's an exchange between two senators, Proxmire and Stennis. And it involves a situation where Senator Proxmire was wrong. And the choice was, do you call him out publicly or do you do it behind closed doors? Stennis wanted to do that behind closed doors, done in a private way. But then Proxmire apologized publicly. And I know the quote from DCI Woolsey in the book is, they dealt with one another in a way that small-town lawyers in a courthouse might act. So the way I was just thinking, capping off our discussion now was just, tell me more about how that represents the way that DCI Woolsey carried himself in DC and in his government business and his personal life, and really what's the lesson there for folks out there today in policymaking in DC, in politics? What could we learn from how that situation was handled in that lesson?
Well, Jim faced a number of problems as the Director of Central Intelligence. I think the one that carried the most weight on him and bothered him the most was the Aldrich Ames case. He took it personally. Aldrich Ames is a failure of an entire system. It's not a failure of one person, although there were individuals who should have been more alert, more professional, and it came down to responsibility for this. And as difficult as it was, and as somewhat contrary to the way in which problems are frequently handled in Washington, in which they're sort of brushed aside, nobody really gets blamed, that's not the Woolsey way. There were serious flaws that should not have happened, and the system needed to understand that they shouldn't be tolerated. And Jim went ahead and took the actions. And it was definitely not warmly received inside the building. It wasn't warmly received in some of the associated political areas, but it was the right thing to do. And he stood up for it. And I know it was painful. I know it was difficult. But he put a smile on his face and he put a positive tone on it and he went forward. And he left shortly thereafter just because he realized that in effect it had scarred his reign as well. And Jeff and I, who worked for him, we were very sad that he left. But we understood. We understood why, and all it did was elevate him higher in our esteem.
Yeah, if there's a way to guard the future, I'd happily pass this lesson on to my toddlers as well. It's do the right thing. And that's a good, I think, way to cap our discussion today. And if there is one way to guard the future best, it's probably that piece of advice right there. So,
absolutely.
Richard, appreciate the
Thank
opportunity
you.
to talk with you today, to learn more about DCI Woolsey.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.